So this is the start of part 3 of chapter 1. We talked last time about cave paintings and focused on a couple different specific caves. This will be transitioning to the Neolithic time. And before we get to Neolithic, there's this era in between Middle Stone Age called Mesolithic. Meso being middle and lithic stone. It was a big transitionary period. There's not as much notable artwork. It's more of a cultural, environmental change that was more notable. Intensified gathering, so the hunting gathering became a bit different. And then dogs were domesticated, so the beginning of the domestication of animals. And the Ice Age began to end, so the landscape was changing dramatically. And so we had changes to the way in which Britain was connected to mainland Europe and different things like that. In the Neolithic era, we have quite a change. It's often called the Neolithic Revolution because there's a shift from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. It's where food production is switching to actual crops that you are planting and harvesting and domesticating animals to be herds. We also have the origination of things like weaving, metal work, pottery, and even sophistication like counting tokens. And this contributed to new art forms because of having more stable society with different sort of changing, maturing beliefs and a workforce of people. We began to see in this time big megalithic stone sculptures, things that are like giant stones without mortar. We haven't seen those in the Paleolithic times because there wasn't the same type of ability to organize labor, so to speak. But before we get into the big megalithic stone structures, I want to talk to you about the Neolithic Revolution starting in the Near East and a couple of sites that we'll look at. So the Neolithic era began earlier in the Near East, something about 4,000 years earlier, which is substantially earlier than Western Europe. This is a couple of the sites we're going to look at, one in Turkey and then Jericho down here in Jordan. They had fairly complex urban systems and environments in these areas and a pretty well organized labor system, and they were able to control water to supply to the crops on a larger scale. And there's a lot of things in these areas about agriculture and fertility and rituals being celebrated with like vegetation cycles and birth and death. So we're going to look at Jericho first here and some different objects that were found there, specifically the Jericho skulls. So this is an aerial view of Neolithic Jericho. Jericho is one of the oldest sites of a fortified city. It was probably somewhere in this era, 8,000 to 7,000 BC, but they say it was kind of like abandoned and then eventually inhabited by people who made these objects that we're going to look at. We're going to look at next, which are the Jericho skulls. But they also got the benefits of the area having an unfailing spring and fertile crop production because of that. So these objects, these Jericho skulls that they're called, are pretty interesting, and I think sometimes when I look at them, they're a little bit creepy too. They are actual skulls that have been detached from the bodies, and they were built up to kind of like model the lifelike quality of the face, probably of the person who died, out of plaster. And they have cowrie shell eyes that were put into place, which is really interesting. They're obviously deteriorated a lot because of their age, thousands and thousands of years old. But they're really, in a way, there's a number of them, like the oldest portrait gallery, portraits of like a transition from death to life. Now, I don't think I mean portrait gallery in the modern sense, but more in the sense of that they're actual portraits of people who have lived in the past. So these dead people would have their skulls after they died detached, and then basically have their face rebuilt with plaster, and then the hair would be painted on, and one of them even has a painted on mustache. They're thought to be some sort of ritualistic purpose of why they would do this. So the dead were buried under their floors in their houses, and there's a thought that they probably had some sort of ancestor cults. The ideas of the dead exerting power over the living. They also found in this area statuettes of animals that were probably shrines. So there's some idea that these are, for them, religious in nature, to have these portraits in quotes of people who were probably ancestors underneath their houses. It's pretty interesting, really. And what I found most interesting, not so much is that ancestor worship type of idea, but that they're actual. It's like looking at the face of someone who lived so long ago, basically. I think that I find that the most interesting about them. Of course, it's a pre-literate culture, so we don't really know all the way. It's like I've been talking about, it's some amount of conjecture. The next site we're going to look at is here up in Turkey. So that was where Jericho was. Katal Hayuk. This is kind of a reconstruction or a drawing of what it probably looked like from what they found archaeologically of the type of buildings they had. This would be somewhat similar to what they would have had in Jericho, people say. And we're going to look at a couple paintings from this area, from this little town. One of them is a hunting scene called the deer hunt. What I find interesting, and we're going to compare it in a minute to the bison with the wounded bison and man, is that this is also a depiction of men hunting for animals, but we have, instead of just one man, we have a group of them, singular in a group, and there's a lot more detail in them. You can actually see sort of the outline of the faces, the posing of the figures is more specific. It's not just a line work. And there's kind of a rhythm to them throughout the space in different colors. We even have some details of their chins and hair and things like that. So in our last piece that we looked at with the man, it was like the animals that had all the detail. And this one, we're getting different poses and variety and profile views, like we saw of the animals before, to get the whole of the person, to kind of get their essence. It's still in profile, but there's very much more of a man-centric or person-centric view of this because there's a lot of them and there's a lot of detail in them. Versus before, when we're looking at rhinoceros, wounded man, and disemboweled bison, or wounded man and bison, the man has way less detail than the animals, right? The disemboweled bison. This is getting to where the human figures are almost as detailed, or even in certain way more detailed than the animal figures, the deer. So that's pretty interesting how their ideas are changing in the revolution of their culture, their thoughts, their processes, their technologies, that they're also changing the way they're depicting themselves. I think this is common throughout art history even now, that art is often a reflection of the way we view ourselves or what we think or how we view the world. And then possibly sometime, like we've seen even in this so far, it's a way we think the future will be in a, like, in quotes, prophetic sense. So they believe certain things will happen in the future or are happening with their ancestors, so they make art about that. So it's like a reflection of thought, and also maybe for the people who made it, a sort of foretelling of what they think will happen as well. That's a common sort of thought process about looking at art. So I think the main comparison, like I said, that we could say is how much man is at the center of it. They're still using somewhat similar materials and possibly somewhat similar processes of painting, as in like ochres and charcoals and stuff like that, and brushes. But I feel like this has a higher degree of, in quotes, craftsmanship or depiction going on. So probably the tools are getting a little bit better. And one thing for sure, we know technique-wise that improved in this next piece is a landscape piece. This is the first landscape. It's a watercolor copy of it, actually, of the first landscape. And we think that based on what we've kind of seen of the town and the mountain behind it, that these dots and squares is actually like the village, the houses, and this would be the mountain, and there's some type of volcanic eruption. It's actually still there, this mountain, and it's a volcano in the area, and you can see it from the site. It could be a specific event, but the thought is that maybe it's more like a depiction of an ongoing phenomenon of volcanic activity. If that's true, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know. I'm okay believing it could have been a specific event as well. But maybe then the town wouldn't have survived. So, it's hard to say. Or a specific event of phenomenon. It doesn't really matter too much. The main point about this piece is that it's the first image or narrative without a human or animal. So this would make this the world's first landscape painting. It's pretty amazing. So this is a 10,600 foot volcano in the area that would have been visible from that town. So it's actually pretty believable conjecture to think, okay, that's what that actually is. As far as we don't have writing about it, so it's a lot of like putting together, piecing things together. That's what I mean about conjecture. The next section of this about the Neolithic era is going to talk about monumental architecture. And we're going to examine megaliths and hinges. A lot of them are in Western Europe, where a lot of the really large architectural things that are still existing, like from this era, are. We're going to talk about maybe ways they were built and the purposes of them, and then we're going to talk about some of the techniques for making them, the vaults, post and lintel systems, and things like that, so you can understand some of the architectural developments throughout human history. This is the first time we've talked about architecture, so we're going to keep building on some of our terminology as we go along, and we'll talk about post and lintel systems and how they develop over time. And load bearing and things like that in the next chapter. Okay, so let's look at some interesting megaliths and menhirs and dolmens and cromlechs. Those are all terms that we'll define as we go along. Menhir comes from two Celtic words for stone and long, and they're basically single megalithic stones. Mega meaning large and lithic meaning stone. The ones we're going to look at are here in northern France and Brittany, all around this small little modern-day village of Carnac. And they're called the alignments of menhirs in Brittany, France. And there's these huge, long stretches of these megalithic stones that were added to. Very dense collection around this village, added to over a long period of time, and has these different alignments. And then there's also in this area some graves that were called tumuli, and then some single really big stones as well in circles. But we're just going to look at a few images of different parts of it and models. This is a model of that one right there and how long it is. It's pretty crazy to think about. There's about 3,000 prehistoric standing stones here, and they were taken out of local rock. They were hewn out of local rock quarries, but they're not very shaped. A lot of them are pretty natural looking still, but they were like not shaped into squares, as we'll see. They're unhewn. This is what it looks like in person. Can you think about, just with me for a minute, think about how crazy it would be to move these size of rocks in big lines like this in an era when there's no, a lot of technology that we just take for granted now doesn't even exist. Most everything, really. This is the largest collection of these type of big standing stones in the world. A few of them are slightly shaped, and monolithic means single stones. You're starting to wonder to yourself right now, why would they do this? Why would they put this huge alignments, these huge long lines of giant stones in the ground? Well, There's something to do here that people have said for quite a while, conjecture, I've read it in different locations, like different types of texts, is that these are meant to be some type of fertilizer of Mother Earth. So the idea of a phallic type of fertilizer, that this is something to do with fertilization of the earth and goes back again to fertility. It's kind of incredible, really, when you think about this much labor done for this. What do we think about when we think about stone? Well, one thing I would say is longevity. We even have figures of speech talking about stone being something written in stone means it's stuck that way. If you stonewall someone, it means you stop them. So stone is very, very much about longevity, right? You slept like a rock, you were unmoving, and so to do things in stone, yes, it's an available material, but I also think even for them, it felt like making something very permanent, monumental, long-lasting, important. So they were able to keep adding to these over time, and there's three major groupings that we've been looking at. The Minic alignment, which is 11 rows of stones converging. The Camario, which had fans out into a bigger, wide, let's see, Camario, it fans out a little wider. And then there's the Karoleskin as well, which is a smaller group of 555 stones. There's some really, really tall ones at the very far end as well. And that's pretty amazing. And over in that part to the extreme west, there's also a circle with 39 stones. Mixed amongst all of this is a couple different tumulus graves, and this is one of them right here, this hill. Inside of it is, it's not, the objects aren't there anymore, they've been taken and put into a museum. It was actually built up, this mound of earth, over a grave that had a central chamber which held the artifacts. You could think of this sort of like a pyramid for the Egyptians, a tomb for a member of the ruling class. And inside there were 15 stone chests, pottery, jewelry, and a lot of really amazing things. So they were buried with their wealth, basically. It was excavated back in 1862, and then a chapel was built on top of it. This one is a reconstruction of one that was destroyed in a fire. So those are menhirs. We're going to look at another type of Neolithic architecture. They're called dolmens, and dol means table in Celtic, so that's what they kind of look like. These are graves as well. So the other ones were not graves. The tumulus was a grave, but the other ones were standing stones that were thought to be phallic fertilizer. These are actually also graves. Dolmen means table in Celtic, and it kind of makes sense why they would say that, because they look like giant stone tables. They're also in the same Carnac area of Brittany, so part of this whole giant complex. They usually have 2 or more vertical stones that have a large stone on top of them, and they turn into a passageway for basically the afterlife is what they are. So you have an idea of this passageway, this grave going from now until the future afterlife. And some were carved and others were painted, but I think the really strong idea is going through like a doorway, a tunnel, or a passageway from the present to eternal life. And again, the fact that they're made in stone, and you can contrast it to some of the type of huts we saw in, Turkey, those drawings of those, or even before, tents, that to actually make something this impressive and amazing, look at how large this stone is. They don't have cranes and things like that. To make something like this, you really have to believe that this is an important thing, that this longevity of this object really matters to you, and that it really does actually represent this passageway. So it's pretty incredible to think about that, the effort that this would take. And this is where I go back to what I talked about earlier, the Neolithic Revolution, that the organization of labor and sort of the change to communal living being more like in towns, and trades sort of almost developing, or herding and farming, and then you see the beginning of like pottery and stuff like that, crafts. Well, there began to be the ability to make these giant architectural monumental pieces that they just couldn't have done before without that organization of labor. That becomes even more apparent in the next type of architectural phenomenon we're going to look at, called cromlechs. It's Celtic word for circular place, and these are also megalithic structures in which a group of menhirs form circles and semicircles. It's post and lintel construction. We'll talk about this in various chapters, so you want to know what that means. And there's the largest number of them in Britain, and they're considered to be sacred space markers. The most famous one of all is Stonehenge in Salisbury, England. This is a view of it on the plain of Salisbury. So it's in a giant plain in England. I've been here before. It's pretty amazing. It's not fully intact. Parts of it have knocked over, fallen over. But this is the sort of ground plan of what it would be. First time you've seen a ground plan, because we haven't really looked at architecture on a scale where it was necessary before, but we're going to see more of these as we go. This kind of denotes which ones are still standing and which ones are missing or fallen. So they're filled in how it would have been on this when it was all complete, which they know it was, but pieces of it are missing now. It's really amazing when you see it in person. It's pretty incredible, really. It was built in stages from 2800 to 1500 BC. So we see here what I was talking about, how the Neolithic lasts a bit longer in Western Europe. They were said to be markers of sacred space, and we're going to unpack that a bit more as we go. But first I want to talk about the design a little bit, because it'll relate to that. So there's 4 concentric circles, and then there's this U-shaped horseshoe shape as part of it too. 1, 2, 3, and this one's considered the 4th one. There's a U shape in there. So they also built up the earth around it, and this kind of avenue, and we're going to talk about that as well. But you can see it right here. The outermost posts are Saracen stone. Okay, they're from about 25 miles away, and they're 25 feet high, each weighing about 20 tons. And they were put up in 25 to 1500 BC. Next inward are these blue stones, which they said to have believed to be had healing properties back in this Neolithic era. And they're from 250 miles away. They are 5'7", and they each weigh 5 tons. Can you imagine? 5-ton stones from 250 miles away, all the way to this site without any type of modern machinery. I mean, that's really incredible. The next inward part, the horseshoe arrangement in the very middle almost, is from, again, the Saracen stones from 25 miles away. And they're 25 feet tall, and they each weigh 20 tons as well. So that's same as the outside ones. And then the innermost ring, again, is from Wales, 250 miles away, and they're the same blue stones that are important to them. Way out around here is a heel stone outside of the area, way back up there. It stands alone on this avenue to the east, which is interesting. We'll talk about that. And then there's a sort of ditch ring around the whole thing that's about 300 feet around and marks off this sacred space for them. And then there's these kind of barrows that are in there, aubrey holes and barrows, where we'll talk about what some things that have been found there. Okay, so this is what it probably would have looked like. It's a recreation drawing showing you the heel stone, the barrows, the outer ring, and then this is an intact model if everything was in place. There wasn't any decoration or writing on them. The barrows are individual graves that are found around them, and the aubrey holes have rubble and cremated human bones some of them with deformities. So there's been an idea, these are the Aubrey holes, individual graves, and then the barrows. There's been an idea that they thought that this place was a place of healing, and because there's people who whose bones they found from quite a ways away. And then the heel stone is sort of like the marker of the entrance of the sacred space. There is a stone in the very middle called the altar stone, right there. You can see it in this picture, sort of. And it's thought to be, it's just called that. There isn't really any evidence that they actually slaughtered like human sacrifice or anything on it, but or that it was used for any sacrifice, but that's what it's called. What is the function of it? This is a hotly debated topic. And you get different type of funny documentaries about, things like this all over the internet in different types of sources. Some of them scientific and some of them less scientific. There's no written record, right? The culture that produced it didn't have a writing system, or if it did, we haven't discovered it. So we don't know exactly how it was built and for what purposes it was used. And there's a lot of myths around it. One of them, though, is not a myth, but we don't know how it related to what they wanted to use it for, is it does have alignments to astronomical observational type of things. So there's some connection maybe to the sky and celestial phenomenon. So we think that maybe they had some sort of rites, sacred dances, and it's connected possibly to the winter and summer solstices and life in the summer, sort of like the resurgence of spring. It's aligned to positions of the sun and moon in parts of the year, so there's very much, this is pretty realistic idea that it is connected to phenomenon in the sky. The great ones that encompass the horseshoe as arrangement of 5 of them in the heel stone in this avenue are aligned to the sunset of the winter solstice and the opposing sunrise of the summer solstice. So that is pretty clearly part of it. When they excavated the sites around there, they found a lot of animal bones to suggest that people gathered at the site for the winter rather than the summer, though. So that leads us more towards, okay, the sunset of the winter solstice being the more important of the two for them. It's a little bit difficult to say what it precisely meant for them. There's a professor named Jeffrey Wainwright who teaches at Bournemouth University, who suggests that it's a place of healing, and he argues that this is based on the high number of burials in the area that they found, and then the evidence of like trauma and deformity in some of the bones. Also, these blue stones on the inner circles have a really, really interesting acoustic property to them. They sound like a loud clanging note when you hit them. And it could be an explanation of why they brought some of them from 250 miles away. Those are the blue stones. They're actually such a note that they were even used for church bells at one time. So it's a real thing. So to haul them from 200 to 250 miles away is a huge technical accomplishment at that time. And so we guess that we know in certain ancient cultures that rocks ringing out are called lithophones, were believed to contain like mystical healing powers. So Stonehenge may have been related to that. There's some type of history of association with rituals that possibly this could be part of. And they're actually from quarried in Wales, and they were used, as I said, in church bells up until the 18th century. So this is a real thing that they do have acoustic properties. We think in the end, though, probably the site was multifunctional and was possibly used for other things. So it could have been a place of healing, rituals and rites to do with the seasons, maybe ancestor worship, all together, like all of the things, not just one of them. But analyzed some of the burial individuals, and there was a teenage boy uh, who was raised near the Mediterranean Sea from about 1550 BC. There's somebody they know was a metal worker from 2300 BC, dubbed the Amesbury Archer. He grew up near the foothills of Germany. So we have like people coming from really far away to come to this. This is the inner horseshoe ring here. And there was even a guy who came from Wales or Brittany in France. So to come here from far away, it must have been important for some of these type of reasons. This is looking outward towards that heel stone down from the middle, so that's kind of where the sunrises and sunsets would have been happening opposite each other, lined up there. There's another guy named Mark Parker Pearson. He's from Sheffield University. He thinks it was part of a ritual landscape that was joined, and this is why I'm showing these pictures of the heel stone, that this site was joined to another henge in Durrington, Wales, which is another place. And that place was the place of the living, and this place is the domain of the dead. And between them is an actual river called the River Avon. So he thinks that this river was connected to the idea of a ritual passage from life to death to celebrate ancestors and recently deceased people. And the other one's design includes like celestial observatory functions as well. So this could have allowed them to predict like eclipses and solstices and equinoxes. So maybe those type of things, celestial phenomenon, were important to their religious beliefs. And that does seem like it could make a lot of sense, especially when you line them up in a way and they're both seem to be kind of connected. So this is a big question. What is the function of Stonehenge? Does it have, I think in some way, no matter what we can say, because of how well it's aligned to these things, it does have something to do with, things in the sky, the longest and shortest days of the year, the equal equinox, the equal part of the year. So how was it constructed? How are they transported for so far away? There's little or no direct evidence of the actual construction techniques. There's been over the years various supernatural suggestions of supernatural construction. That people say, but this is kind of one of the main ways that people think. They use some sort of sled on poles that they kept, like big logs, poles that they kept moving and rolling them over. And they've kind of talked about possibly that this track of logs would be able to be rolled along for a very long time. There was another idea that they were put on some sort of sleds and moved in a different way with animals helping. There's just a bunch of different ideas. So this is one of many about how they were moved. This is an idea of how they were moved by a river, making some sort of boat. They attempted to recreate this, where they were taken from Wales along the coast up. This is Wales over here, the Bristol Channel. This is the River Avon over here. So through Bristol, down the River Avon, and then Stonehenge was finally taken, like maybe using this other method on the land. So that's another idea. And then people have also attempted to create like these sort of sleds. So it's somewhat mysterious to say which exact one it was. Who knows exactly? Other people have said like ball bearings sort of made out of stone, like big marbles basically. Once they were there, how did they raise them into these post and lintel constructions? There's different ideas about it, digging part of a hole, then building it up with wood, and then dropping them into place. Or some sort of A-frame pulling on it like this and bring it into place. Or it could have been a combination of these type of things. Both of them make a lot of sense to me being combined, like building up logs one bit at a time. You can move really large things this way. And then using force to pull them down into the hole. And then how did they get the lintel on top? So these are the posts, which is the lintel here on top after that. So you have the two posts and you have to put the lintel. There's been an idea of building it up and pulling it and then putting it on top, or doing it this other way, building it up, building it up, building it up like they did with the logs that way, and then putting it on top. So, or maybe some combination of the two, using leverage basically to put it up there. So to be able to do this, they had to have the ability to work with wood, and to fabricate, devices that would help them to have leverage and things like that. So it's pretty interesting. No matter which way they did it, they had to have ability to do carpentry to erect things like this. There's a guy in 2003, a retired construction worker named Wally Wallington, demonstrated some ingenious techniques on fundamental principles of levers and fulcrums to show that a single man could rotate, walk, lift up, and tip a 10-ton cast concrete monolith. He actually did this on his own. So he could use all these type of basic lever and fulcrums and counterweights to do this. So if he could do that, I'm sure they could do that. There's pretty complex stuff. So these are not people we can think of as, Neanderthals to be able to do this type of stuff. Pretty amazing. Just want to make sure you understand the terminology of post and lintel. So this is post and lintel construction. This is the kind of construction we'll see quite a bit at first, and then it progresses into different versions. The main thing I want to say about this is you would have had to have a really strong advanced social organization to do this, because estimates of manpower put the total at millions of hours of work. So stage 1 is like 11,000 man hours, stage 2 360,000, and then stage 3 may have been like up to a million hours or something like that, which is incredible, really. That means you have to have a lot of people working on that to be able to do it. So the estimate of 20 million man hours, which people have said, means that 10,000 men working on the site for 20 days each year for 8 hours per day would have taken 12 and a half years to complete. That's just kind of to give you an idea of the scale of this thing, if they just worked on it for part of the year every year. At the top of the post and lintels here, they have what is called a mortise and tenon. So the upright post has these little tenons on it. These are the parts that stick out, and the mortise is inside of it. It's like goes into a pocket, like a peg into a pocket. I need you to know this terminology, and that's what helps hold them into place. So they have a mortise and tenon as part of that. Pretty interesting, and that would be something you'd see a lot in carpentry. People even use it now to build furniture and things like that. So pretty amazing, complex stuff. This cromlech, the most famous of them, is pretty amazing. Stonehenge is a cool thing to see if you ever get a chance. I definitely recommend it. You can't walk around it like you used to be able to anymore, because it's gated off. It's like roped off now because people are carving the names into it and stuff like that. So, which is a bummer. But okay, guys, I hope you're staying well out there and staying up on your readings. This should take you through the entirety of chapter 1. So you should be done with that, and then you can be ready for your test by reading the book, watching these lectures, and this will help you out with your writing assignment too. So you want to start looking at that and thinking about that stuff. All right, take care.